Good evening, everybody. My name is Kristen Fletcher. I'm the Programs and Community Engagement Manager here at the Hailey Public Library. Tonight, we are delighted to partner with the Wood River chapter of the Idaho Native Plant Society in hosting this, episode of a series we call Wanderlust. And we're going to be listening to Bob Moseley, who's a conservation ecologist and botanist, and he will be talking about the Eastern Himalaya, wildflower diversity, conservation, and Tibetan traditional knowledge. Ted Stout will be introducing him in just a moment and telling you a little bit about the Native Plant Society.
This looks like a really exciting talk tonight. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I just got to talk to Bob for a couple of minutes, and he is a fascinating guy. For 25 years, he explored all over Idaho. He was a research biologist, a horsepacker, an endangered species botanist. He was the director of the Idaho Natural Heritage Program. He co-authored a field guide to alpine wildflowers. I'll show that off to you here. And these will be sitting on the table back there if you want to take a closer look. In 2000, Bob moved to Southwest China. Big change from Idaho. He was part of the founding team for the Nature Conservancy's first program in Asia. For 6 years, he led field-based projects to establish new national parks in the high mountains of Yunnan province, a place that just has extraordinary cultural and biological diversity. 2 books resulted from that work, and he'll be talking about this one quite a bit tonight.
Kawagabo.
What?
Kawagabo.
Okay, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but he will pronounce it properly. And also, this one isn't on the, oh, yeah. And this one is back there too, Revisiting Shangri-La, which
Photography book.
is a book of photographs that show that area as well. So Bob moved back to the U.S. in 2007 to continue to work for the Nature Conservancy in the Midwest. And in 2016, he started directing the Asia Pacific Cities program based in Hong Kong. So he's had a wealth of experiences all over Idaho and all over Asia as well. So it's great to have him here. And without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our speaker, Bob Moseley. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. This I don't need, right? Here, I'll give this to you. Can you have enough hands?
Oh, you're already wired up.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful afternoon here in the Wood River. I live in Boise these days. It was a fun drive up. So let's project more. Okay, project. So the eastern terminus of the Himalayas end in Yunnan province of China. And I'll introduce you to that place tonight just to set the stage, and then talk about this amazing plant diversity in these areas. That's sort of the wildflower diversity part of this. The conservation and Tibetan traditional knowledge part is the second half, with covering sort of how local Tibetans use the plants, how they view this plant diversity, and then also a little bit on the relationship between the sacred geography of Tibetan Buddhism and biodiversity conservation. Has anybody actually been to Yunnan? To Tibet, Lhasa area? So, one sort of big disclaimer. This is sort of ancient history. I went there just after the new year in 2000. Y2K came and went, luckily. But a few days later, I landed in Yunnan. Bill Clinton was still president, if you can, jog your memory on those events. So some of this is a bit outdated. And I lived there for 6 years through 2005. So that's a long time ago in Chinatown. So this shaded relief map in the upper left shows the whole country of China. I think you can make out that big white blob that covers a lot of Western China, a big part of the country. That's the Tibetan Plateau. We know that the Himalayas are the southern border of that, and they end in Yunnan province. Yunnan's an amazing place. So it's about as big as California. And like California is to the US, it's the most biodiverse province in China. It spans the Tropic of Cancer, that red line, so it's pretty low latitude. And in fact, there's tropical rainforests on the border with Laos in the south, and at the north, it's like Arctic Tibetan Plateau stuff. And there's a lot of life packed in between those 2 points. Our project area for the Nature Conservancy was the northwestern part of the state. I'll dive into that a little bit more. For reference, that's about the size of West Virginia, or an Idaho scale. That's what we used to say to people from the US. It's like the size of West Virginia, but we're in Idaho. It's about a quarter of the state of Idaho. So it's a pretty big chunk of ground that we had as our project area. Yes. So I went there with the Nature Conservancy to help start up the Yunnan Great Rivers Project in collaboration with the Yunnan provincial government, which is a whole other separate show. I'm not going to really talk much about that at all. But we were drawn there because of these 4 great Asian rivers that run in parallel canyons through this area. They all start in different parts of the Tibetan Plateau. They converge as they're going around the eastern end of the Himalayas, and then they diverge into different oceans after they leave northwestern Yunnan, both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. This river here, the one on the east, is the longest of the upper tributaries of what in the west we call the Yangtze. They call it something totally different in China. There is no Yangtze in China, by the way. The next river over here is the Mekong, what we call the Mekong. It's called the Lansang, and you'll hear me refer to it as the Lansang River. Then you go over the divide in the Salween. We don't hear much about it. It's gigantic, and it goes out through Thailand. Really big river. And then a tiny little tributary of the much larger Irrawaddy, which is the river of Myanmar. So these 4 great rivers. Let's see. Here we go. I drew this little cartoon to kind of show you a cross-section of this to bring it home. Oh, I have to point it this way, probably. There we go. So this sketch is only slightly exaggerated in the vertical scale. This is a really steep place. The distance between the Yangtze and the Dulong, that Irrawaddy tributary, is only 50 miles at the closest point. And just in terms of vertical relief, we're at the lowest point along the Salween River where it exits the project area, and the highest peak is a difference of 20,000 feet. Not uncommon, I mean, that's kind of extreme, but not uncommon from river to ridge to have an 8,000 to 10,000 foot just hillside. Really extraordinary place. The color bands here you recognize from the Wood River, right? They're life zones going up the mountainside. Here, that yellow represents the subtropical zone, so it doesn't freeze. At the lowest, it's it's wet over on this side, and then you get in these rain shadow over here, and it's really dry in this subtropical zone. Then you get some temperate forests in the middle, the green, and then up through the alpine and rocks and ice up high. So let's take a little jog up the mountainside to sort of show you some of these habitats, these life zones. So we're subtropical. This is evergreen broadleaf forest. Almost all of the species of trees in here do not lose their leaves during the wintertime. Some do, but it's mostly because of drought. This is strongly monsoonal climate. It rains at least a little bit every day in the summer, sometimes a lot. And it's dry and clear all winter, like when I took this picture. This is near the Myanmar border, which is just over the hill of this thing they call Moon Hill. So over the rain shadow, it's like going over from West Cascades to the East Cascades in Oregon or Washington. You get into these really arid canyon bottoms. This is along the Mekong, shrubland with villages embedded in that area where they can get some water and it's flat enough to raise some crops. Pine forests, as you move into the lower forest zones, for all the world, here, this is wintertime again, nice clear blue skies. This looks like a young ponderosa pine stand if you was over on the Boise National Forest or the Payette National Forest, as if you were in Idaho. But one thing, if you go back in the spring and see this, you'll know that you're not in Idaho because there's rhododendrons blooming in the understory. That's not the Boise National Forest. Up a little bit more humid, a little more rain, you get a forest that you'd be right at home with if you were hiking or lived up in Sandpoint or the Priest River Valley. Big hemlock there on the upper side of the trail. Straight ahead, that tree in the middle is a yew tree, Taxus, common forest species in the northern part of the state. This forest, however, has a lot of broadleaf trees, more cover and more species than we would have in Idaho. But they're maples, birches, mountain ashes, things you would recognize from around here being Idaho, Northern Rockies. Something you would not recognize is this really weird forest made up of an evergreen oaks, a number of species of evergreen oak. In Chinese, it comes out translated as hardleaf, and they are really thick evergreen leaves shown up there in the upper right. This was up above the office, so this is like, goes from like middle elevations, maybe 11,000 feet or so, all the way up to tree line, believe it or not, an oak at upper timberline, crumholtzed, windswept, grading into alpine meadow. Really bizarre vegetation formation. Spruce and fir look familiar, right? Same old, except you still have to look a little closer in the understory. There is lots and lots and lots of species of rhododendron in this zone. And they even throw in a few bamboos, this kind of shrubby, low-growing bamboo, which makes this really horrible place to bushwhack through, especially in the rain. So it still sort of looks like, wet Selkirk's, northern Idaho panhandle kind of forest, except there's monkeys swinging through these spruce and the fir. The Yunnan snub-nosed monkey, one of the most endangered primates in the world. It occurs on just a few mountaintops in Yunnan on one of those spiny ridges that I showed in that sketch. Anyways, definitely not Idaho. The uppermost tree line where that fir, this is an Abies, the fir trees run out on that hillside, is among the highest upper tree lines in the world. This is kind of petered out around 4,000 to 4,200 meters. So it's like 14,000 feet. So it'd be like having forests up to the top of Mount Rainier. It's really extraordinarily high. In fact, Renee and I even found a larch at 15,000 feet. Doing okay, I guess. Into the alpine zone, there's kind of three habitats that we distinguish. This sort of herbaceous meadows, these shrublands that have lots of species of these low-grown rhododendrons, and then also some juniper also back there. And then above that, in the, let's see, got it, here we go, is the scree slopes. And just like Idaho, just like the Rockies, there's not many species that occur in these slopes, but the ones that are there are really cool if you're a botanist and a plant enthusiast. And we'll actually explore some of those later. So overlaying this physical and this biological diversity is a pretty unusually high cultural diversity. So this is a list of ethnic groups that occur in our project area. They're represented on the map and their dominance, their populations within administrative townships. Just as a simple sort of representation of that diversity. The north, the orange part, are Tibetans. They, of course, extend for hundreds of kilometers across the plateau, the Tibetan Plateau to the north. The brownish area down in the middle is the Bai people, B-A-I. That is their homeland. They don't extend much beyond that. That's where they occur. And there's some other ethnic groups that have even smaller ranges, smaller occurrences within that area, like the Dulong and the Pumi. And this is actually even a simplified representation because they're also stratified elevationally going up the mountains. There could be a Bai rice farmers in the valley, maybe Lisu villages in the center of the mountains, and then Yi people, the Y-I, scraping out a living on these high ridges. You might also not be surprised that there's a lot of language diversity here. Many of these ethnic groups don't have a formal written language. But this was a sign that I hung up when I was set up an office in Dechin, way up here, with English of the Nature Conservancy, the Mandarin of China, and the local Tibetan script. Okay, getting to the plants. Through the intro now. I told you that northwestern part of Yunnan is about a quarter of the state of Idaho. And it has about more than twice as many species in that little place as the entire state that we have here. And when I first went there, it was in the winter. I was running these workshops with these experts from the Academy of Sciences. And I'm going, how do you fit that many species in such a little place? It's kind of hard to explain, but it is true. I'll try and show you a little bit of that. Here are the foremost speciose genera in northwestern Yunnan. All of these occur in Idaho. With pedicularis, which is called like lousewort, elephant's head. You may see it in the meadows around here. Ridiculously, like over the top, diverse. There's one of those 200 species shown in the picture, but followed pretty closely by rhododendrons, primroses, gentians. Another way to sort of look at this diversity is the rates of endemism, the occurrence of plants that only occur in northwestern Yunnan. This is just the genera of plants with more than 10 endemic species. All of these occur in Idaho: monkshood, saxifrage, gentian, larkspur, willow. The only two that don't are the this ligularia and cremanthodium. They're kind of Asian, very diverse Asian plants. They don't occur natively in North America. So how to sort of show you this diversity? It was kind of, I didn't really quite know where to start, so I started with my favorite genus, which isn't actually even on these slides, and that's the genus Meconopsis, a poppy. Often called blue poppies, because they do come mostly in various shades of blue, but they're also purple. And the most common one that I actually encountered was this yellow one, which Kristen chose for the promo of this. Another one that actually doesn't even make it to those lists that I showed you in the beginning is jack-in-the-pulpit. It's in the skunk cabbage family. There's a couple of species in North America. There's about 100 in China. And it was always fun to encounter these in the forest zone of sort of weird shapes and sizes of those inflorescences. This couple of orchids, ladies' tresses orchids by the genus Spiranthes, pretty common in meadows around Idaho. The white-flowered version, still that same spiral arrangement of the inflorescence, grows in kind of wettish meadows. This particular pink one is apparently common all over China. There's a few other species. Pleone is one of my favorite orchids. It occurs in kind of seepy, high elevation rock outcrops, but with drippy wet, and they're always really fun to encounter. There's a couple of species that you used to see here and there. And then there's lady slippers. So we have a couple in Idaho. They're up north, mostly in the moister forests, I think. You may be getting kind of with it here that there's a lot more species in Yunnan. And indeed, they come in a lot of different forms. And in fact, these four closest to me on the right, those photos were all taken within about a 1 hectare, 2 to 3 acre remnant forest around a Buddhist shrine. You just sort of step across into a new habitat, and there's like that old species of Cypripedium doesn't drop out. You get a new species of lady slipper, and so on across the landscape. It's really amazing. In fact, that pink one on the far left was maybe at most 2 or 3 kilometers away from these other 4. Which then brings me to primrose, which are one of those sort of over-the-top diverse genera. You cannot walk across a mountainside in Yunnan in the spring without trampling primrose. There's a handful in Idaho, rarely encountered. There's about 20 species in North America. That first shot, had the number 120 species just in our project area. And in this meadow, there's 3. There's this yellow one just coming out. There's the red one, the Secundiflora, nodding heads. And then there's this big common pink one, which I don't know the name of. The really common high elevation species in the forest and a little bit into the alpine. And I only encountered this yellow one a couple of times down in the pine, rocky areas in the pine forest. And the Primula bella, the beautiful primrose, this diminutive little, but very common plant up in the alpine zone, et cetera, et cetera. lots of shapes, lots of colors, lots of sizes of these things. I have to stop somewhere, so I'll stop with this one and move on to another, but still stay within the primrose family. So I think it's called rock jasmine, the common name. Androsyche is the genus. I call them mini primroses. They occur as kind of isolated plants like this, or they're kind of clumpy, sprawly things, or even this dense alpine cushion primrose. And then the rhododendron. There's the uppercase rhododendron, and then there's the lowercase rhododendron and azalea. I'll explain that a little bit. They're all shrubs, members of the heath family, the Ericaceae. But the shrubs can sort of vary from creepy little alpine things to tall trees, actually, beyond shrubs. And they come in all shapes and sizes and colors and leaf shapes and da-da-da-da-da. The horticulture, I'm not much of a gardener or horticulturist, but the horticultural trade and gardeners distinguish between rhododendron and azalea. You've probably heard that. I didn't actually know that very well until people started peppering me with questions about it. So I learned that, but there's 600 species native to China, 160 in our project area. There's about 25 in all of North America. Those definitions that gardeners use to distinguish those two completely break down in the wild when you have that much diversity all piled in together. It just taxonomically, scientifically, those definitions of azalea and rhododendron don't hold up. There's just too much intergradation of those. So anyways, that's my azalea versus rhododendron talk. But Zhang Zhongyun in the red jacket was a Tibetan ethnographer that I worked with. She's holding a sprout of one of the tree-like rhododendrons. But you couldn't walk around the corner of a trail and come up in the May and not see another one. It was difficult leading donor field trips, right? So we're the Nature Conservancy, we have to raise money, and people would come from the United States and want to see what we were up to. And if it was in May, and I had to get from point A to point B, you know, our next night where we were going to stay in this town, it was really hard. So I did like no more photos of rhododendrons. We're not stopping again. And then we go around the corner, and of course we'd see some, you know, amazing new thing that we hadn't seen, and everybody piles out. And I had to build that into our our trips, but it really was true. You just keep going and going. This is the beautiful Yunanensis, rhododendron Yunanensis. Pink, yellow, and red, 3 species here. This beautiful blood red sanguinium. Kind of one of the sort of forest species grading out into the alpine here, kind of windswept, still doing pretty well. Those beautiful pink flowers. Most of the alpine ones are these tiny or shorter shrubs with tiny leaves. Could be yellow flowered, could be purple flower. This photo here, there's 3 species across the bottom that I just showed you. And that yellow one in the middle is kind of still in bud, but there's the little purple one and the bigger pink one. The white one in the upper right here, believe it or not, after what I just told you about primrose, has flowers that are dead ringers for primrose flowers. Like, is this too much of a coincidence or what? But it's Rhododendron primuliflora, another sort of common alpine species. So enough of that. But I'll show you one last one. So this is this amazing sort of Rhododendron forestii, named after a guy named George Forrest, this little creepy alpine thing. But I want to show you another member of the Ericaceae family, the heath family, that does occur in Idaho. This little kind of short sprouty thing that it's growing with, phenologically a little bit earlier. But later it'll flowers and it'll look like this, which this cassiope, it's called. This occurs around the high lakes and the Sawtooths, for instance. You would see something very similar, different species. The flowers look really similar, though. Back to the herbs. Gobs and gobs and gobs of gentians. These are like 3 of the most amazing ones that I had pictures of. Sandworts. We have a number of sandworts in Idaho, from the hottest desert to the highest mountain. None of them are quite as dense in their arrangement as this one. This is a high alpine cushion plant. Our dogwood, so if you've been up in the Lochsaw and Subway country, we have a native dogwood. It has these 4 white bracts, just like this one, and a little cluster of flowers in the center. This particular one, as those fruits mature, they kind of aggregate together, and turn into this pink fruit with wonderfully sweet, fleshy flavor. It's really great. This is from a village market. She'd collected them along with some walnuts that are also native there. So you saw a bunch of pine family things in the sort of the intro. A couple I want to tell you about is the lansang fir that occurs along a segment of the Mekong River, very highly restricted. In this part of the world, we call it Douglas fir. It's our Douglas fir, which is super widespread. This is really rare, and it's actually endangered under Chinese law. But for all the world, it looks like our Douglas fir. The cones are a little plumper, but you would recognize this. And then there's the deciduous larch, which we have in the northern part of the state, an alpine larch, very similar to this. It turns these brilliant orange as it loses its leaves in the so northwestern Yunnan is the source of hundreds, maybe thousands of species that are now very common in gardens in temperate regions of the world, north and south hemisphere. You may have seen some in rhododendrons you might have recognized in gardens. One of the most common, of course, is lilac. Every town in Idaho has a lilac. And like when in the spring, at the right time, this has really strong lilac odor. And in fact, when I was hiking down the trail, I sensed it with my nose long before I actually saw it. I had to look up above the trail to find it, because it is a dead ringer for what we have around here. There's about 20 species native in this part of China. So some of these, what I've showed you so far has been kind of maybe familiar a little bit. Even in Asia, this is really unfamiliar. So the ginger family is hardcore tropical, subtropical forests. These tall herbs that can go, 8 or so feet high. They have flowers that look like that. So it's really weird to come out into sort of a meadow out of the forest and see these ginger-like flowers on a stem that's only a couple centimeters high. This weird genus Roscoea, I think, is maybe like the only one that's not really tropical. Another one that's really kind of amazing because they're so large the flowers compared to the plant and compared to sort of any other flower around it. It's in the catalpa family. It's called Incarvilia. To know the street tree catalpa, which even grows across from my house in Boise, is not to know this family, because there are some herbaceous members like this that have amazing flowers. And here's a bouquet of Incarvilia here at a Buddhist shrine. Early spring flower. Those white stems in the Pepsi bottles are, those white flowers are an almond or apricot, one of the native apricots. So I'm going to end this kind of onslaught of flower pictures here. I hope you get the picture of sort of how amazing this place, the floristic diversity of this place is, especially, for me, having spent 25 years sort of looking at the botany of Idaho before I went there. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about how local people view all of this plant diversity. And a large percentage of the population in this area their livelihoods are subsistence. They have small plots for farming, they graze animals on the mountainside, but they rely on the natural resources around them for energy, for shelter, for food, for medicines, and for spiritual needs. And every one of these groups uses that land for subsistence differently. It's really amazing. It actually makes it a hard place to work. It'd be easier if everybody did the same thing, but they don't. So anyways, it's pretty cool. I worked up here in Chin County with Tibetans, so that's what I'm going to tell you about. That's what I know the best. But keep in mind as I go through this that the stories I tell could apply to any one of these groups, not just the Tibetans. It just happens to be what I end up knowing. And so I'm going to start with ethnobotany, how people use plants. And this was a pretty major research effort with the Missouri Botanical Garden, Cornell, the Academy of Sciences in China, their Institute of Botany, and many others, actually. And it was led by this woman, Jan Salick, who was the ethnobotanist from Missouri, which is one of the premier botanical research institutions in the world. It was a real sort of honor to be able to work with them on this. She's there with her daughter, who joined her on one of her trips. The Nature Conservancy's role, we did a little bit of the research, but our main role was actually translating those research data into information that we could use for our conservation to make it better, to make it more efficient, to make it more equitable. And that was the idea for this book that Jan and I wrote after it was all over, was how to use ethnobotany to meld to work together with the local ecological knowledge of the local people, Tibetans in this case, and the kind of top-down techno-sciencey approach that Western conservationists usually use. In our case, really focused on design of new protected areas, conservation areas, and this became eventually a national park. We interacted with local people in all sorts of different ways, qualitatively and quantitatively, village elders, lay people, religious leaders, doctors. And at the simplest qualitative sense, it's really about documenting the use of the flora in their livelihoods. And so I'm going to tell you this story about green manure, green fertilizer. This is Adong Village. This is over the hill from where I lived. And it's in April or so, April or early May. Whoops. The fields here between all these big walnut trees are the winter crop of barley. They're still ripening, so it's got a ways to go before it gets harvested. Look at those houses. So when you're standing next to them, they're really gigantic. But they include lots going on in there. The bottom floor, which has no windows, is the barn. That's where the livestock live. That floor with the windows across is where the family lives. And then the roof and sort of associated little third floor, top floor, is where the crops are dried and stored after they're harvested. So the green manure story starts in the barn. And here are these three women have been up in the Yunnan pine forest collecting pine needles that they'll bring down to their village down below and use as a base material in their barnyard. This actually isn't Tibetan. This is some Bai people from the farther south. This is a Tibetan barnyard. Here you can see a couple layers of brown and then fresh leaves of that hard leaf evergreen oak, which are kind of golden on the bottom side. They have these golden hairs. This base material then, over the course of a year, is trampled, defecated on, urinated on by yaks and pigs and goats and humans, and it becomes really good fertilizer. So back in Adong, this is in October, you can see the corn. They have just harvested the summer crop of corn. It's drying on the roofs there. They put on their baskets again. They fill it all with this stuff that was in their barnyard, their barn all year, and they put it out in the field, and that's what all those amazingly equidistant dots or little piles of the manure that they've hauled out there on their backs. They'll turn this in pretty quickly and to fertilize their fields and then plant the barley for the winter, which then you see in April. So to kind of complete the agricultural annual cycle. So that's just a qualitative way of documenting how they've used different parts of the native flora. Jan and her students took this quite a bit farther and quantitatively documented the patterns of biodiversity, patterns of use. And they ran these transects up the hillsides, mountainsides, at different villages in the Lansang Valley. And I'm going to represent very, very simply some of their results on this graph that has number of plant species, just simple number of plant species on the bottom, and then elevation low to high on top. So total number of species in their transects was highest at the lowest elevations and the highest elevations. In Idaho, this would be linear, high, low to low, way up in the alpine. Alpine systems in the Rockies, North America, even Europe, are not very diverse. Cool plants, but they're not very diverse. This is actually as diverse as the subtropical zone, pine, alpine. Jan did this really cool thing. She got the Tibetan doctor from each village to join their sampling teams. So he was able to record all the uses of plants. And that graph looks really similar. Not surprising, they use a lot of plants down around their villages at the low elevations. It dips again in the forest zone, but it's really high in the alpine, higher actually than the lower in terms of useful plants. That turns out to be in the alpine meadows which I talked about, and it's mostly medicines. Meanwhile, this botanist from the Academy of Sciences, Ma Chong-Lu, and I looked at biodiversity patterns across the project area. I won't bore you with this too much, but we looked at endemic plant species and endangered plant species in different life zones across that area. This is what we found. We found that the highest rates of endemism were up in the Alpine, followed pretty closely by the lowest elevations, the subtropical zone, which also had the highest number of endangered species. So in this particular instance, our sort of typical conservation priorities for the flora, if we're looking at important habitats to conserve, actually is nearly identical to what you might call the livelihood priorities for these local Tibetans, low and high elevation zones. Let's see, what's next? So a couple of stories about medicines, plant medicines that are used by the local doctors in very small amounts, but are really endangered because of commercial collection. They're commonly used in the Tibetan traditional medicine trade and especially the Chinese traditional medicine. Heidi Schmidt and I were walking out of the mountains one spring. Heidi worked for Jan at the Missouri Botanical. We came across this encampment of people who had collected these rosettes of some gentian, which is family, one of these three genera probably. There was no flowers and we didn't know the flora well enough. But each of these genera have species that are used pretty prominently in medicines, in traditional medicines around China, and collected commercially at pretty large quantities. That's a lot of gentian plants that they've collected. The second example is rhodiola, or roseroot. We know them as these succulent things we often call sedum, which occur around Idaho, mostly as small plants. Here they're like these gigantic clumps of red flowers. There's one that's an amazing yellow flower clump. One winter, kind of a slow season, I was headed up onto the Tibetan Plateau to just putter around, and came across these kids along the highway, which was a really rough dirt road actually, hawking these big massive roots of a rhodiola species. In traditional Chinese medicine, rhodiola, one of the things it's used for is to treat hypoxia. So there was a lot of people traveling along this road from low elevations in Yunnan to the high plateau, delivering supplies and whatnot, goods to the towns, that probably do experience hypoxia. And so they had a kind of a ready-made clientele passing them all the time. A little more serious, though, is this group of Sasaria species that grow at high elevations called snow lotus, the Shuilian. You can read this quote from the Flora of China a few years ago. Heavily collected, have been for a long, long time. It's a member of the aster family, grows at high elevations, hence I think the snow part of it. So heavily used in traditional Chinese medicine for lots of different things, you can actually buy dried specimens of these in little plastic bags at the airports, in case you want some. So I was hiking up above the office one day, captured this species of snow lotus at 5,000 meters. Super vulnerable for a number of reasons. The first reason is 5,000 meters. That's like 16,500 feet. Plants don't grow too much higher than this. This is really super low productivity environment to make a living in. The second reason is its life history strategy. So it germinates and puts along for a number of years in the talus, this loose talus, as rosettes. You can see the rosettes down in the lower right in a vegetative state. Then some years later, it flowers, seeds, and then dies. It's called a monocarpic life history, so one fruit. And then on top of all of that, it's considered the most potent at prime flowering. So it gets collected before it has a chance to set its seed and reproduce. So super vulnerable species. And Wayne Law, a student of Jan's, did a really fun little project among many things he did. He looked at the size of plants on herbarium specimens from herbaria all over the world, got lots and lots of collections, and was able to show a significant decline in plant size over the last century, almost certainly due to this heavy collection pressure, as kind of one indication of what it may be doing and how much these may be in jeopardy, some of these populations. So a little story about climate change and the impacts of climate change on this system, especially the alpine system. So I actually wrote this other book that he showed using repeat photography. It's an environmental history, and I used sort of repeated images from different points in time to look at changes in culture and in the environment, which is like a whole other talk. I'm not going to say too much about it, except I'll use this photo or this pair to look at some direct impacts of climate warming on the alpine system, and then reflect back on that Tibetan ethnobiology research on what it may be doing to the alpine flora and plants that are culturally important to Tibetans. And one other sort of backstory here. The Tibetan Plateau is kind of the high elevation analog to the Arctic, the high latitude Arctic. It's warming at a 2 to 3 degrees centigrade more, or 2 to 3 times actually, faster than we are experiencing here at the mid-latitudes or at lower elevations. And that's visible in this. Barry Baker and I actually ran around Baima Pass. I got a whole bunch of other photos from Baima Pass, and we were able to document that forests are moving up the mountainside in elevation 8 meters per decade, which is pretty fast if you're a forest. It's like a galloping forest moving into the alpine. Other woody plants are responding in the same way. In this case, in the foreground, you can see these rhododendron, shrubby rhododendron have pretty much decimated or sort of moved into the alpine meadows. And the same actually is the juniper in these back slopes over the last 70 years. So we now know that these alpine meadows are the most species-rich habitat out there almost. We also now know that this is where most medicines that local Tibetan doctors use occur. And I didn't tell you about this, but yaks prefer these for grazing. This is where they produce the most butter. And it may sound a bit trivial, but without a Tibetan without yak butter tea is hardly a Tibetan at all. It's really important culturally. In fact, we were hiking up above Yubong with Aju, the doctor here, and he is burning a little incense cedar or some juniper and praying to the gods before he goes out and collects his medicine in the meadows. But before he did anything, he started a fire down here in the corner and started brewing up his yak butter tea before he did anything else. Okay, so moving into the last part of the program, and looking at the sacred geography of Tibetan Buddhism and its relationship with biodiversity conservation. So being a botanist from Idaho, I had like no clue what was going on here. I sort of knew, was hearing things. And luckily I ran into this guy actually ran into me purposely and took me under his wing as a teacher and mentor to help me see this geography that I really had no experience with. He's an ethnographer from the Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences named Guo Jing, and some of his colleagues, like Zhang Zhongyun, that woman in the white coat that I showed you, she also was instrumental in this. So I'll start the story with Coagabo, which is the name of that one book, which is this peak here on the left. It's the highest peak in this particular range of mountains. It's, for more than a millennium, has been considered the abode of an important fierce warrior god of Tibetan Buddhism named Cohosted. Shown here in human form on this big mural in a local temple. It is one of the handful of most sacred peaks in the entire Tibetan world. And it's also, not surprisingly, the center of this sacred geography here in this part of Yunnan. Pilgrims from all over the plateau come here to do pilgrimage. They bring a lot of prayer flags, for sure. These women are from, you can tell by the dress and their dialect, that they're from the northern part of the plateau, several days' drive away, and in what is now Qinghai province. Whereas this family is from a nearby county, probably Mangkan, sort of a little ways to the east in what is known as the Kham region of Tibet, which is now in the, what they call the Tibetan Autonomous Region. These sacred spaces around Cohosted are venerated by Buddhists from throughout the Tibetan world. But it's the local villagers who are the day-to-day, year-to-year stewards of these places, right? And with Guojing and Zhang Dongyun and some others, you know, we sort of understood this geography. I began to think that this could be mapped, sort of. And in this conservation biologist, we map all sorts of bio and physical things we can see and touch. And I was wondering if we could compare them and see how they map out. And with some great sort of folks to help me along, we piloted this in Yubung village, shown here. And we didn't really have a good, there was no model, so we sort of made it up as we went along. Anyways, and we looked at a couple of different things, rare plants and vegetation types, so kind of habitats and some of the rare species. Yeah, so Yubung is an amazing place. I was doing a lot of work there, and it's right in the heart of these sacred landscapes around Cohosted, so it's a really perfect place to do this. So kind of a basic GIS map of the Yubung River drainage. These two red dots there are the upper and lower parts of Yubung village. The last photo so it takes a few hours to hike over the mountain into this place. And I was coming over the ridge and took that last photo up this drainage to kind of give you a reference point to the peaks on the crest. So we found that there is this spiritually mediated zoning system in this valley, roughly zoned out into these 4 units. With zone 1 is kind of loosely what I call kind of how they were explaining to me, but it's a pure land. There's off limits to humans. It is the abode of some really important goddesses, plural. So nobody goes there, ever. Zone 2 is sort of like, I don't know, ordinary sacred land? I don't know, but there's certain things you can't do. You can't cut trees, you can't hunt, there's some other things. You can collect plants, you can collect mushrooms, you can graze your yaks there. There is certain things you can do. And then zone 3 is an extension of the no hunting extension of zones 1 and 2, which also have no hunting. And then zone 4 is kind of like anything goes. Very long story short, we were most interested for our purposes in just these zones 1 and 2 for looking at potential protection and how to zone a new national park. And we looked at the distribution of some rare plants. This is that lansang fir, like our Douglas fir. You can see that it all occurs in zones 3 and 4, so it's pretty heavily exploited by the villagers. It's a really useful tree species. Contrast that with these alpine larch, which are just those little dots up in the upper left. That is pretty uncommon. It's really rare in this particular mountain range. Not of great conservation concern. It's pretty well protected by this sacred landscape. So a bit abstract on maps. I'll show you sort of a real life example. This is coming back to that evergreen oak forest and above Hailey Village. So everything that's green on this foreridge around the village is that evergreen oak. And when you come down this ridge here, you can see the change in stature from this oak to this oak. It's all the same species. They coppice the oak, if you're familiar with that term. So they'll use the oak, they'll cut it down, it'll sprout. They'll use it for bedding for their barnyards. We know about that. They also, when it gets about this big, it's good for firewood. It's kind of an easy to handle size. Really important for the livelihood of the village. And that's what all of that below the red line is, a scrubby oak that they use continuously. But they have made off limits this sacred forest of really big oaks. Again, sort of like Yubung, these are mediated between the religious leaders at a nearby monastery called Hongpo. This is very close to Yubung, and enforced by the village leadership. Even though it's that close to the village, they do not cut any of those trees. They collect mushrooms in there, they collect plants, they do other things, but they don't. And there's a lot of sort of sacred sites within that forest. Last story to tell you. This one is about sacred spaces, climate change, and glacier retreat. Cohosted, as I said, is among the elite of Tibetan sacred mountains. Not surprisingly, this glacier that descends off the summit is also sacred. There's 2 temples along the side of it. This is the upper one. And this, if you step around the lower one, it looks like this. I lived near here. I was up in here occasionally. And it didn't take actually that many times, maybe 2 or 3 times, to notice that as I was hiking up, the toe of the glacier was receding, moving up valley. And the ice volume at the lower end was decreasing. And all this sort of gravel and soil was being ending up on top, on the surface. So it was changing from this pretty white to this kind of ugly gray and disappearing. And so there was a caretaker monk at the lower temple one day, and I asked him, so what do you think about this? And you're losing your glacier and it's turning ugly. And the response I got just completely floored me. He expressed in kind of so many ways that it was divine punishment. Cohosted was punishing him, and I think sort of his fellow Buddhists, for not being devout enough, and that they were the glacier was receding and turning ugly. And I'm going oh my God. And I probably, started gesticulating wildly. Said, it's not your fault. It's my fault. It's my tailpipe emissions. It's my people. It's, Western industrialized societies, this completely misplaced spiritual angst of this poor monk who has an infinitesimal, carbon footprint. My assistant was this really great guy named Norbu. It's a young local Tibetan guy who could go directly from Tibetan to English. So I got to explain to this that it's not his fault. Unfortunately, this was maybe 2001. So global warming, climate change wasn't really talked about it like it is today. And so Norbu didn't even know about it. And so here I am trying to explain to Norbu about CO2, the greenhouse effect, industrial revolution, coal burning. And then he's trying to translate this into Tibetan for this guy, for this monk. And Tibetan's a pretty conservative language. It doesn't incorporate new ideas very easily, new concepts. Anyways, of course, I did not connect. And I felt guilty ever since about that. It sort of carried that with me. And I forgot this slide. Oh, sorry about that. So visualize the recession of this glacier. I kind of got this really interesting time series. And most of the recession took place after 1994. Our friend Fan Zhendong was there on a botanical expedition. So this is the view out and back of the lower temple. So that's the end. This was like the hardest job I ever had, most challenging, also the most exciting, as you might imagine, sort of really in a very intimate way, working with all of these mountain folks in northwestern Yunnan. Also a shout out to my wife, who somehow got her job based in Yunnan and actually joined me in a number of, quite a bit of this work. And a lot of, she has a lot of photos in this slideshow. Some of them are attributed, a lot of them aren't, but yeah, so. Thanks, Kristen, for inviting me. As I put this together, it was sort of fun reliving, you know, all this really cool time that I spent here. So I'm ready.
Wait a sec, wait. First of all, let's thank Bob for a fascinating presentation. Thanks, Bob. And for questions, what we'll do is we'll start on this side of the room, ask whoever needs to. I'll hand you the microphone so we can capture it onto our video, and then I'll go to that side. I'll go back and forth as many times as we need. So here you go. Just speak into the microphone.
How did you handle the language? Did they understand English, or did you have a translator with you all the time?
Yeah, so when they asked me to go over there originally, I think Ted this earlier, they asked me to come over and do a workshop for 1 month. And then at the end, they asked me if I wanted to stay. So it was like a 1 month job interview. I said, cool, I could do this. But I don't speak the language. I mean, this has got to be. And they said, no problem. We actually need your technical expertise. We can hire translators. It was a challenge, obviously, because my assistants were mostly Chinese who could go from Chinese to English brilliantly. They're really fluent. It was when you get out in the countryside in all of those languages, and it was really hard. Luckily, Norbu was my guy, you know, when I lived and worked up in that part of the world. But there was times when it went from Naxi language to Chinese to English, you know, and there's that movie Lost in Translation with Bill Murray, where this conversation in Naxi to the Chinese person goes on for like, 10 minutes. Then it goes from Naxi to Chinese another 5 minutes, and it gets summarized in one sentence to me. So I learned to let go. And I also had assistants. I said, just go listen. Tell me at the end, sort of give me the Cliff Notes version at the end of it all. I don't need to be there to know every single word. I sort of was able to sort of step back and find that worked just as well. So yeah, it was a challenge. It would have been easier if everybody spoke the same language, but they didn't, and that's cool too. So.
Anybody else on this side with a question? Yeah.
I want to know about the food.
Yeah.
What did you eat?
Everything. So I miss the food of Yunnan. There was some times in the villages, especially in the winter, where it was a bit skimpy. It was pretty much like pig fat and a bean or two. But mostly it was super food, really great food. Now, that's a longer conversation. I could talk about Chinese food and Tibetan food. I loved yak butter tea. A lot of Westerners that travel there can't stand it. I loved it when I was living in the house in a village, and in the mornings you'd hear they emulsified in a churn, and I'd hear that in the mornings when I'm laying in my sleeping bag going, cool, yak butter tea is coming. And some of the local cheeses that are made from yaks and meats that are made from yaks and things like that, but lots of noodles. They have supplies of typical Chinese dishes, hot pots. This part of Dechin also has tons of mushrooms, lots of different species. So in the spring, it was really great, and lots of other things like that. Dogwood, those dogwood fruits. Like all of a sudden, there's a big, bowl of them in the market, and so you check the market all the time for what's cool coming out of the mountains. So, anyways, that's just a really, yeah.
Oh, I'm going to I'm going to ask a question. Your accommodations, speaking of food and going to markets, where did you stay, and did you feel comfortable going to the markets and just buying food from folks and eating it?
Yes. I had an apartment in Kunming where Renee and I lived, which is the capital of Yunnan. And for a couple of years, I lived most of the time up in Dochin, although I was in and out of there a lot over the years. And I lived at the office. And we actually had a cook who at the office. But the food was great. So China, Tibetans, and other ethnic groups, they cook all their food. There's no raw food, anything. So it's very rare to get sick from foodborne handling. That was never a problem. You know, whether you liked pig intestines or not was a different story, but you know, it was always going to be cooked really well. And so I felt really comfortable. Yeah, we used to go to the market all the time in Kunming, and you know, just local shops to eat. Yep.
Then a question over here.
My friend who couldn't come tonight called me right before I left earlier and said, where can she buy plants, species of plants, seeds and plants?
From this part of the
Yeah.
world. Well, some of them, as I said, are like standard horticultural stuff.
Yeah.
If you research back to where those came from. I do not know of any source of seeds. I bet they exist. I am not much of a gardener.
She already has blue poppies in her yard.
Yeah.
So I don't know what.
Yeah, I'm not a good person to ask. I'm
Okay.
really terrible at growing plants. I'd like to know where plants grow and how they grow there, but in the wild. But I'm not good at that.
Anybody on this side right now before I switch? Somebody over here had a question?
If you'll permit, I have a more general question and a very specific question related to one of your slides. The general question is, what is the rate of demographic change in these rural areas of Yunnan with these different human groups? Are they losing population? Are they losing the children to the state capital or other cities? Are the people from Greater China coming there to harvest these plants to sell in the airports, as you mentioned? I'm wondering, is this continuing to exist as it has in the past?
Yeah, so there's that big disclaimer at the beginning. So this is like 20 years ago. Try and get at some of those things. So yes, there is a big movement of the younger generation into the cities. They could be the county towns or the prefecture towns or possibly the provincial towns. There is that. Younger people are seeing what's out there. They're not really into the subsistence stuff. So that is changing. I think sort of in a very natural way. Some of the big tourist towns like Dali and Lijiang and Zhongyan, these sort of big population centers, we're finding more and more, even when I was there, and I've heard it's way different since, there used to be local people at these shops that were in these really cool kind of mountain tourist towns. Now they're all from Sichuan province or from somewhere else. There's outsiders who have seen the potential for money, have the money to invest. Prices go up, outsiders come in. That whole sort of same scenario that's happening in Boise is happening there also. Does that get it? I sort of lost track, but.
Well, I just wondered if the cultures in the mountains are
Right.
Disintegrating or becoming impossible to sustain for many reasons.
I think that's still largely a subsistence economy in many, many places in Yunnan. Some are just so remote in the mountains. There's a lot of new infrastructure and roads going to these villages, but there's still not a lot to do, and except sort of survive on the land. And if you go into some of these Tibetan villages, they look really prosperous. They have all the food they can eat, subsistence-wise. And Tibetans are actually interesting because they also have polyandry. So they actually, a wife can have more than one husband in a household. And so they actually end up being richer because the older brother usually stays on the land. The younger brother herds the yaks up in the mountainside his whole life. And another, maybe the third brother goes into town and it actually enters the cash economy. And so they tend to be pretty well off. They don't, in fact, until they got TV and radio, they probably didn't know they were poor. I mean, but yeah, so, and that's what's drawing some of that culture's being lost as a younger generation. It's not being passed on to the younger generation. Very few young people know how to write Tibetan, for instance. They're not taught it in schools, and they're not being passed down within the family either. As they leave and go outside. So yeah, it's changing. It'd be fun to go back and see, sort of sad actually, probably to go back and see all the changes that since I was there. And you had a specific question. I hope I answered.
I do. It's about the Hailey slide, where you delineated the edge of the coppicing in the oak forest and the higher unaffected oak forest on top of the hill, but very close to the village there. I'm very curious if they left the yaks to go into the upper forest there.
Yeah, so they could graze that. Yep, it's pretty much not cut trees in that particular spot. So that wasn't like that's pure land as I had mapped in Yubung village.
Well, the reason I thought of that is because in California oak forests, for example, the cattle eat the oak seedlings, and there's no regeneration. All the oaks are very old. Are all these oaks very old with no regeneration?
Yeah, I think so. We didn't really look at that, sort of those age classes and what was going on with the grazing so much. Yeah, it could be that way. Those are pretty dense, and there's not much reason that they'd go up there, actually, because most of the yaks, so I took that picture kind of looking across a small valley at that ridge. Most of the yaks they would put up on pastures up on the mountainside. They wouldn't really run them much at all, but it's close enough to the village where they could be eating the seedlings. I don't know how palatable those hardleaf oaks are. It's not like a young sprout, so.
Thank you. Someone else here?
Yeah, I just had one question. So why do you think that area is so biodiverse? It's just amazing. Why is that particular area just brimming with so many different species?
The short answer is I have no idea. I was astounded. As I said, I ran these workshops when I first got there, and it was in the winter. And all these experts are showing me these numbers, and I'm going, how does this happen? Until I got out there in the spring and saw, wow, it's true. And there's no good explanation for it. It probably goes back to some of the geologic structural history of that part of the Himalayas and its interface with, subtropical latitudes and lots of rain in the summer, and probably a whole bunch of things. And I don't really know why so many, especially these very prominent genera of plants, primroses, rhododendron, are centers of their diversity, are all in the same spot right there. Yeah, so good question.
Mind-blowing, yeah.
It looks like based on the diversity, there's not a whole lot of invasive species problems there, or have you seen that?
Good observation. Yes, there isn't.
Okay.
I don't know why either. That was another big, sort of one of these big questions. Why, like everywhere else in the world, especially in temperate zones, invasive species are just horrible. And so kept asking botanists, like, where are the invasive species? And they're not there. And human use is really old, so they were arguing at the time whether there had been humans there for 700,000 or 1.7 million. Either way, humans have been on that landscape for a very long time. So they co-evolved with the plants and probably the yaks. And yaks are native there. There's actually a native cow down in that subtropical forest over on the Myanmar border. And so they kind of evolved with that level of disturbance. And then all of this species diversity leaves no room, ecological niche-wise, for invasives to get a hold in. I don't know. It's the same pressures are happening there as anywhere else, but yeah, pretty weird, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have lost so many species. Our continent
Here's that.
very diverse. Thousands of species have been lost. Oh, sorry. Thousands of species have been lost on our continent. Wherever there's civilization and manipulation of the fauna, you lose a lot.
Yeah, so the flora has not been documented well enough over a long enough period of time there,
Yeah,
like it has in this continent,
yeah.
to know kind of what's been lost. They're starting that now. We're starting, even with animals, it was pretty hard to know, because there was
Yeah.
3 kinds of leopards in our project area. There was the
Yeah.
clouded leopard down in the evergreen, the subtropical forest. There was the snow leopard up high, and then there was the leopard. I don't know what it is, spotted leopard?
Yeah. The
Kind of
natural
around there
world.
too. But they really, nobody had really good data on what was being lost for very long, for a period of time that was sort of meaningful. We were trying to initiate those kinds of monitoring programs to actually get those data, but
It's pretty interesting how many kinds of carrots we had. And now there's one kind,
Huh.
or 2 kinds, if you're lucky.
right. Yes.
So it's just, we've lost a lot, and they're living in a natural world somewhat,
Yeah, they,
slowly, and native people, even our native people, know how to manage things, manage the fauna so they have enough to eat.
yeah, one of the
And so
premises of the book was
Yeah.
that these Tibetans have living in a pretty harsh landscape
Yeah,
for many millennia, and must have some of it figured out to be sustainable to live in such a place.
yeah.
We didn't sort of venerate them in the way that they knew everything. Like, they're still collecting a lot of snow lotus.
Mm-hmm.
They like the cash. So it's the villagers who are up there collecting all those
Yeah.
plants for the cash crops. And so, and they
That
don't like wolves any more than U.S. ranchers like wolves. So there is those sorts of issues.
Bob, does anybody else have a question? I have one last question coming from me, but does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? So it sounded like you were collecting sort of baseline data on biological diversity, especially plant diversity, for development of a possible national park. What happened with that? And how did your work and the team that you worked with, how did that factor into conversations about development of a national park there?
So one of the sort of more obvious things, for instance, with the sacred geography work, was incorporate that zoning system into park management. And in fact, when I first went there in 2000 and started working on this, the idea was for a nature reserve, which in China meant a very kind of hands-off place, which mostly meant the rock and ice up high, right, where people weren't and didn't use that much. And it's not like we need another one of those. And I got to sort of working with Jan and lots of other stuff going on that I didn't talk about. And I'm going, man, these people are living pretty sustainably as it is. They've lived here for a long time. There's certain things we could tweak. But I'm really interested in the diversity of the entire mountainside, from where the villages and people live and are pretty active, all the way up those mountainsides. I want the whole thing in a conservation area. That's where there's so much life packed in those elevational gradients. I don't want just the upper part of it, even though it's pretty important, as I showed. So that kind of idea was incorporated into park design. So it wasn't just a nature reserve up on the top of the mountain. It was kind of the whole system. It included the people and their land use, which does maintain a fair amount of that diversity. So I didn't want that excluded. So what I showed you here and some other things led to those kinds of conclusions as one example.
Well, great. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Let's thank Bob again for a great talk. And you might be interested, the 3 books that he mentioned are on the table back there, so feel free to take a look at that. They're fascinating. And if you can take a few minutes to fill out that survey, I always appreciate that. So thanks again. See you next time.